I also, in my previous job at Texas Tech University, I was a consultant with Sorority Fraternity Life. We primarily responded to negative incidents that happened in organizations, which was undesirable. It's much better to be handling it proactively like this, so I'm glad to see y'all here. In that role, what would consistently happen is that something negative would happen whenever the incident was, and then I would talk to like 20 or so people individually, each one of them as around saying, I thought this was a bad idea, but I didn't say anything, which was a consistent theme across every single time it happened. So part of what I wanted to keep in mind during this brief time we have together is how do you foster an organizational culture where people are not saying that after something happens, where people do feel able to talk about anything that could be happening. And that can be anything from, bad public relations events to some places had people attempt suicide, speaking of mental health, and people in those instances, people every time said, I thought something was off, but I didn't know how, or I didn't feel able to talk to them about anything. So just keep that in mind as we talk. What they asked me to talk about was, in specific, was toxic masculinity. Is anybody familiar with toxic masculinity? Maybe you read BuzzFeed articles or stuff about it. Can anybody sort of go over what it's like, what it's about, as an idea? You don't have to be right. Yeah.
I don't feel comfortable defining it. I'm not sure what the exact definition is, but it's basically like sort of this idea that society and stuff perpetuates that men have to be a certain way. It's usually that they're taught to suppress their emotions and to be super aggressive and that leads to dangerous outcomes.
Right. That's a really good definition summary, actually. One of the things I'll make clear that it's not is negative about masculinity in general. The phrasing of it is kind of unfortunate. So it's not at all about masculinity as bad or anything like that. We can take, the best example I can think of is competitiveness. Competitiveness is great. Competitiveness drives societies forward, drives innovation, etc. Competitiveness is really good. But there's a different kind of competitiveness that's grounded in what we call zero-sum thinking, which is that the idea that there's a limited amount of stuff, and I need to get all the stuff I can and screw everyone else. When that happens in relation to competitiveness, what can happen is that instead of wanting to be the best of a group of really good people, on your sports team or in your workplace, people who have zero-sum thinking and are toxically competitive will work to sabotage all the people around them so that they're the best by default, rather than the best by effort. And so I'm incredibly competitive about everything, but I would never sabotage the people who I compete against. I would just want to be the best of a really good group. And so there's a really healthy, the first kind of competitiveness is what we call a healthy manifestation of masculinity, and the second is what we would call an unhealthy or toxic manifestation, because it's toxic to the entire organization. A business that has people that are sabotaging each other is going to do way worse than a business where everybody is cooperating competitively. Backward as that sounds, you can do that. You're all working together because you all want to be the best, and each of you wants to be the best at what you're doing, and you have to beat really good people to be the best. That would be an incredibly powerful and efficient organization. You can think of it as something like self-reliance too. It's great to know how to change your own oil and to do things for yourself and things like that. But I have had patients who have destroyed their house's plumbing systems because they thought they could do that themselves, and they didn't want to ask for help from a plumber, or barely went online to look at what to do, which would have inevitably led to them finding out that they cannot do that. I've literally had more than one patient destroy their house's plumbing systems because of that. Yeah.
Also the stereotype that men won't ask for directions.
Yeah. I know where I'm going all the time, but every other man seems really bad at it. And you mentioned socialization messages too, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. What's the message that young boys get when they don't succeed at something? If you fall off your bike when you're learning to ride a bike, whatever. What do parents say? get back up, try again, and try harder. And you can think about how that kind of message can work well if you're learning to try to bike or learning to play guitar or something. But when it comes to interpersonal relationships, when someone says no to a date or no to sex, if the default response is try again and try harder, that can lead to really negative outcomes. And so that would be another manifestation of toxic masculinity, that overgeneralization of what can in some cases be an adaptive strategy. Does that make sense? Can you think of ways in which you might have observed that kind of toxic masculinity in interactions you've had or observed among other people? I'm a therapist, I'm really good with silence. I can ask you.
Please state the question.
Yeah, have you observed where people have sort of taken those messages, the socialization messages, to too far of an extreme? Not a good example of this, of the socialization message too. I talked about that a little later. But can you think of any examples? No, that's okay. You can probably think of examples for the next one. Another related thing that we do research on in my lab is called precarious manhood. So many men view masculinity not as a thing that they automatically are, like they don't view themselves as automatically men, but view masculinity as a thing that gets bestowed upon them by other people. And because of that, it has to be earned and maintained and is at risk for being lost. This is why it's possible for it to be an insult to call a man a boy. You know, he's not, but you can call him a boy and it's an insult. Or you can call a man by a woman's name and it's somehow an insult. That doesn't make sense unless it's that you can't call me short and have it be an insult. That just isn't, I'm not. But why can you call me Brittany and it's supposed to be an insult? Like that doesn't make sense to me either, but it's possible. And the reason is because many men view masculinity as a thing that they have to earn and then maintain, and that can be taken away from them. In my research lab, what we do is we can actually threaten men's masculinity. We have them take a fake test. Well, first they take a real test of, it's a real test, but they don't get real feedback on it, the conformity to traditional masculinity. Then they take a fake personality test. It's just a bunch of items that randomly assess nonsense pieces of the personality. The computer says, calculating as if it's making their scores up. They all see what's called a Barnum personality profile. It's a fake personality profile. Everyone gets the same one. It applies to every human being. It says things like, you feel very secure, but sometimes you feel unsure of yourself. People are asking to take photos of this in my lab. They're like, this is the best personality test I ever took. This is so accurate. This is to make them believe the next part is real, which is that they see a bell curve that says they're either really masculine or really not masculine. When we tell people that they're not masculine, they let me crush their hands in my pain machine more. I have a little machine that crushes people's fingers, and they let me crush their hands more than the group we told were masculine. They'll make more negative judgments about women. They'll think sexist jokes are funnier. They'll punch punching bags harder than they were if we told them they were masculine, because they are acting to like reclaim what we told them they don't have. You can think about this, how this might work in interpersonal relationships. Getting rejected for a date or for sex or something like that. And the reaction that you might have observed some people have to that, if they feel as though their masculinity is being threatened by this refusal, then they might start reacting really negatively. And you can think about how that can work with those socialization messages to produce really unhelpful responses in some people. Can you think of examples of times that you've seen people do that, have that kind of reaction? Yeah.
The thing that comes to mind is like, I know that like people who like perpetrate mass shootings often have a history of domestic violence, and one that specifically comes to mind was in California guy who kept getting like rejected by girls, and now it's like this whole movement, which is really weird. But like, and then he.
Oh yeah.
And then he like shot a bunch of people on his college campus, and he shot women on his college
Yeah,
campus.
and that's not new. That happened in Canada 30 years ago. The Montreal shootings. He actually went into an engineering classroom and shot women who were in the engineering classroom because he felt stilted by women.
Yeah.
So that's not even a new thing. That we learned about that. I'm Canadian. We learned about that in school when I went to high school 5 years ago.
I think like this is like a personal story. Like, when I was like in 6th grade, I remember one of my buddies, like this girl I liked him instead, and so I've only punched one person in the face ever, and I punched him in the face. I was in 6th grade, gave him a bloody nose, and it was all because like he took the girl that I wanted at that time.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and so that kind of response. I mean, people do that when they're 26. Yeah.
Yeah, I have so many friends that have broken hands and wrists and punching walls and stuff.
Yeah, punching walls. Yeah. And so that would be a maladaptive expression of aggression. Yeah. So you can think of examples where people can do this. In my lab, frankly, what I really want to do is get a bunch of them drunk too, and then try their masculinity and see what happens. They're safe in my lab, but you can think about how that might happen. You're all under 21, right? So none of you drink at all. But when you eventually get over 21 and might choose to go to a bar and have alcohol, no, should not be done yet. I'm faculty, so don't tell me about that in class. People get in situations in which their inhibitions are even more lower than you probably weren't drunk at the time. But people's inhibitions, you can imagine what can happen if people's inhibitions are even further lowered. What people might be capable of that they might not otherwise even do if alcohol is also involved in the situation. So what do you think you can do in your organizations, thinking really broadly in terms of lowering an atmosphere of toxic masculinity and encouraging helpful masculinity, not having that kind of precarious manhood stuff come up, and also encouraging people, facilitating an environment that's open to people raising their voices when they think something is off, or being able to be really supportive of other people. So thinking about things like the suicides that I've had to deal with or attempted. What do you think your organizations could do?
I think it just starts with like normalizing it.
Yeah, how so?
Just like anytime somebody, like if somebody were to like come at you with like masculinity, be like step back, be like, okay, like yeah, sure, like you're the more masculine one, whatever. But also just like, don't be weird about it. Like, you know, you're just trying to set an example and like be a role model for everybody else. So.
Mm-hmm.
I think the older members of organizations can really influence the younger members by just showing them that they aren't competitive with each other and that they're all equal and all on the same level and that there's no competing.
So some influence from both like official leadership and sort of like unofficial, like senior member leadership.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest things that we know from retention research is that people who are at higher risk for dropping out of university or college are really benefited when they're able to connect with someone who's been through similar-ish struggles. Because it can be really hard for people, even in close-knit organizations, to talk about how like they aren't going home for Christmas because both of their parents are alcoholics and they don't want to deal with it. That's not an easy thing to bring up in a lot of organizations, but to have an open conversation where people can talk about those sorts of things if they're struggling with them can really make some people who are otherwise envisioning all of you as having great lives that are really wonderful understand that everybody has dealt with struggles, especially adjusting to college and dealing with being a freshman. What are other ways that the organization can be supportive of its members in being open about mental health and being open about dealing with issues like domestic violence or dating violence? Yep, and so that's what the Mass UT program helps and can definitely consult with fraternities on. It used to be that organizations like Mass UT that focused on domestic violence were very often hosted within women's centers at universities, which are very often rooms that men are not even allowed to go into. It's like a women's only space. And so obviously they weren't part of the conversations and programming and felt excluded because they were excluded from that program. And so Mass UT and a couple other programs like it across the country are really aimed at including men in those conversations by posting it first, not in the women's center, but and then actively including men in the development of programming. So we'd be happy to consult with any of your organizations, send someone over to talk about anything you wanted to, like talks at Tejas before, things like that. You mentioned destigmatizing too. So if people are struggling with mental health issues, really taking that on before things happen. One of the things that happened with a lot of the suicide attempts is that people afterward, when the 20 people came through my office, each of them said things like, I think that I thought that something was going on, I knew something was off, something seemed off or not right. I had no idea what to do. When I asked him, he said things were fine. So what do I do with that? I said, are you upset? And he said, no, I'm fine. And I said, okay. And then a week later, he tried to kill himself. So people very often, if conversations aren't had well before, they are done reactively. And then people can feel even worse about bringing something up, because if the only time you have a meeting to talk about mental health is because someone says they're depressed, then it actually ends up being punishing for the person who is having the problem, because you have to have they feel like you're having an entire meeting about me, and aren't I so awful and bad and isn't this terrible? But if you start the conversations way before, then it naturally builds itself into the culture of the organization, and if something does happen, it's way easier to talk about it, because it's now part of the culture that you're talking about mental health or whatever. Does that make sense? Are there ways that you can think of that you can incorporate that kind of an approach into your organizations?
We kind of already do. It's kind of like part of the like pledge education, and we have like a whole week we're like dedicated to where we'll have like 45-minute meetings, and it's talked all about like mental health, and because we had suicide in like 2013, I think, or 2014, and so like we just talk about him because it was a guy that it was all fine, he was fine, he helped everyone out, but then like something like it happens, it could happen to any of them, so it's kind of like very like you have to be open with each other because like everyone's faced these problems. It's like, like a whole week of like that kind of education.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great thing to do. That's yeah.
There's some things kind of sounds cheesy, but it's called like a care committee. So like there are people like in every grade level that are like closer with the younger members that are kind of just like observing like, are these people showing up at meetings? Like what do they seem like? And so like there's an appointed person to talk to, like in kind of a discreet way, like so-and-so hasn't really been around lately, like is everything okay? Like are they overwhelmed with classes? Like perhaps like check in with them, or like they haven't stopped hanging out with their friends, they haven't like been returning their phone calls, like that's kind of weird, like maybe we should look into that.
Yeah. And how do they respond?
Usually like pretty well. I mean it's like done in a very like discreet way, just like making people aware. I don't know.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, individually, you wanted the sort of theme to be very public and handling it to be very personal,
Right.
so that people don't feel like they're
Put on the spot.
put in the spotlight for having a concern like that. Yeah. Anything else?
I feel like maybe making like your organization an environment that like no one should be scared to like talk to someone about something, like scared that they'd be blamed for like something that might have happened to them or something. So like creating the like atmosphere, I guess.
Yeah, so creating atmosphere people feel open to talk about that with at least a handful of the other members, and also making sure that's not just on all y'all who are in this set of meetings, because there might be some members with whom you just don't know as well, who don't feel able to go to you as easily, or you get the flu and you're in the hospital for a week, or something like that. And so making sure there are lots of people who are on board with this idea so that there are lots of potential resources for people to go to. What else? What about stuff on campus that can be helpful if they can't find help within the organization? It's on the fifth floor. Anyone know? So the counseling center is up there, and any of them or anybody in counseling in the counseling psych department would be happy to come talk to your organizations about mental health, about some people don't even know what therapy looks like if they've never been. They think it's like the TV thing where you go and talk about your mother for an hour a week, and it's really not that. We're trained to really help people with whatever problems they're facing, so including things that might be harder to deal with, like seeing people for conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder or things like that. That might be harder to bring up than something like depression in the groups, in the organizations. So one way to do that would be to destigmatize it. Some groups, some organizations will openly advertise the CMHC service, the Counseling and Mental Health Center services, so that if the postering is all around your house, then people know or have an idea that if you actually show up there and tell people about it, no one's gonna be really judgy about it. You have 5 posters from the counseling center up in your thing, so somebody put them up, somebody was thinking of it, no one's putting stuff over it, so somebody values it. Have anybody from, like I mentioned, anybody from the counseling center would be happy to go talk to your organizations about what therapy actually is, how it can be useful to people, what kinds of things people come in for. Some people on the opposite end of the talk about mother thing think it's only for people who are like in the middle of a complete breakdown and everything in their life is going horribly. And we can help with that, but it's for other things too. And so many people have not an unclear idea of what counseling even is.
What's great about what y'all do as parents is that you are kind of being proactive in the presentations that you do, like once a semester, twice a semester, whenever. Even though half the time it seems like people are probably not listening to a word that you're saying, they're still seeing it, they're seeing it repeatedly over time, and if a situation's ever to happen, that's like the first thing they think of. Even if they don't remember exactly where to go, they do take little tidbits of information. So these presentations really are helpful, because even if they don't feel like they're listening all the time, if they ever really need it, it does come to mind, and it really does impact them.
Yep, that's exactly it. Like when we do tabling at the CMH for the Counseling and Mental Health Center or whatever, we don't expect people to be filling out appointments right there. We don't expect it at all. What we expect is that they become aware of it, and then when something happens that they feel they need to talk to someone, then they feel able to. It's exactly how you would sort of like work with people one-on-one or from leadership. So if leadership is consistent about bringing up issues of mental health or dating violence or anything like that, then if something were to happen, people know where to go and and are already prepped on sort of the basics of it. If people need mental health assistance, they can know that they can come to any of you or some of the other people in the organization who are they feel safe talking to, and or head over to the CMHC, and no one, if they find out about it, is going to make fun of them. Any other strategies your organizations could implement to help facilitate that? Open dialogues, mental health, dating violence dialogue. I think you covered most of them. You covered leadership and peer support, and then destigmatization of help seeking. So those are really the 3 biggest things. So what are ways that you can actually like do that? Like interpersonal support, how do you actually do that in your organization? If I go to an organization and I say they have great interpersonal support for their members, what are they doing that another organization isn't doing?
So basically making sure that if somebody needs them on a personal level, they're there like for them on a personal level.
Right, yeah, good. And and so setting that as a culture, like in the case of people who are dealing with depression, having sessions on like how do you ask somebody if they're feeling down. Usually their response is I'm fine. But so where do you go from there? And often it can be as simple as, you're not licensed counselors, you don't need to do therapy sessions with them, but it can be as simple as someone, if that person is like staying in their room that evening not feeling great, someone can stay with them and hang out, watch TV or whatever. You don't have to, they just need to know that someone is there and cares about them. You don't need to do something crazy and elaborate, plan some massive thing for them, plan a party. You don't need to plan a party for them, you don't need to talk to them for 7 hours. You can watch a movie with them and they'll feel as though they'll feel that someone is there for them. And that can be sufficient for many people, or at least a good start for many people. So you don't have to carry the burden, yeah.
I think it's like really helpful to implement like mentoring programs of some sort with older and younger members, because the older members are experienced in what the younger member might be potentially going through.
Absolutely.
And so I think that can really help people feel less alone and kind of have someone looking out for them.
Absolutely. And they can model things like, when I was having trouble, I talked to blah, blah, blah. I went to CMHC, I went to health services, I talked to members of the organization, etc. And then that really, as I mentioned, that really improves, especially people who are new at university, their experience at university. Because often freshmen look around and they think, literally all the freshmen look around and think everybody else is doing awesome and loving university and knows exactly what they want to do for their career, has no career decision, and meanwhile they're feeling awful, they're feeling lonely, they don't know what they want to do, they hate their major, and they're the only person who hates their major and doesn't know what they want to do for their career. They literally like 95% of the freshmen all walk around thinking this, and then still into subsequent years. But because no one talks about it, because you're supposed to go into college and know what you want to do and do your career, and it's like weak to even change majors sometimes. People try to avoid talking, like there's even a stigma against changing majors, right? People think like you're indecisive or whatever. I changed majors 3 times, ended up in the best one, so. Yeah, but people don't have that message. Yeah. Some people don't have any relatives who ever went to college, and they have no idea what this whole thing is. Some people's only exposure to college has been watching Animal House, and they think that's what they're supposed to be. Or is there a famous sorority one? All I can think of is.
Legally Blonde, yes.
Okay, all I can think of is the white girls. That's a bad example. But many of them, that's their only exposure to sororities or fraternities. And they didn't have an older brother. Their dad never even graduated high school, so how do they know how they're supposed to act? They don't have that kind of mentorship relationship with anyone. Yeah. I feel like I talked really fast. Everybody looks really tired from work week.
Yeah.
Burned out. Any questions or like take homes from this that can be useful? The biggest take home would be really like try to have these conversations way ahead of time so that members are used to talking about mental health or how to help someone who's dealing with depression or what to do with that friend who seems to be drinking a lot more than everyone else, not that any of you drink right now, but if you were to in the future, somebody who seems to have a lot more trouble controlling it, like how do you deal with things like that? How do you help younger members who maybe didn't have a lot of the resources that some other people might have, or might think that everyone else in the organization, when a guy went to